Welcome, code aficionados and digital daredevils, to a podcast that's about to dive deep into the fascinating world of WebAssembly. WebAssembly, or Wasm for the initiated, is revolutionizing modern engineering, pushing the boundaries of what developers can do. It's like a secret portal connecting your code to the digital cosmos. On this show, F5 hosts will be your guides to this virtual dimension, decoding the mysteries and unveiling the endless possibilities. So strap in for a special bite-sized adventure as we take off with WebAssembly Unleashed.
Thank you, Tabitha. And I am pleased to be sitting at a table with the people I'm talking to for the very first time in our podcast series. Again, welcome to WebAssembly Unleashed. I'm Joel Moses. With me, of course, is Oscar Spencer, my co-host and my right hand in all things WebAssembly. I'm pleased to also have Dave McAllister join us today, and we're going to talk to Dave about some of his experiences in open standards and open source today and how it applies to WebAssembly. But before we do that, I just want to let you know why we're here sitting at the same table. We're here at our customer event. Oscar and I both work for F5 and NGINX, and we've got a lot of customers walking around, and we've chosen a corner of the establishment to talk to each other. And it's great to be here in person. Oscar, what's on your mind this week on WebAssembly?
Well, the biggest thing since the last episode of WebAssembly Unleashed is WASI Preview 2 has officially launched. This has been so much work in the making. The fact that now the component model is actually realized. This is on by default in Wasm time. You can go try it out now. You can use J-code to build JavaScript components. You can use componentized Py to build Python components. And then soon, it's coming, it's getting merged super soon. You're going to be able to do it in Rust. So it's an incredibly exciting time. Obviously, the tool chains are going to have to, catch up and get all the stuff integrated. But the fact that you can now truly build Preview 2 components and compose them together, absolutely huge.
Yeah, absolutely. Right down to actual active work that you can do and moving towards production workloads and everything. It's a huge benefit to server-side WebAssembly, and it's a very exciting time.
And now the work for Preview 3 starts.
Oh, good. Oh, good. So remind me, Preview 1 to Preview 2?
Preview 1 to Preview 2, it's mostly rebasing on the component model is largely what it is, cleaning up some of the interfaces. Learned a couple things that we didn't necessarily need, stuff like that.
Gotcha.
Preview 2 to Preview 3, we're adding async and streams. So that's the big idea of Preview 3. So there's a lot you can accomplish with Preview 2, but obviously there's still more work to do.
Definitely waiting for streams. Now, do you think we're going to accelerate from Preview 2 to Preview 3 in relation to 1 to 2?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So you can probably expect Preview 3 to come far faster than you might think. Not going to throw any timelines at it, but much, much faster than Preview 2 came.
Great, that's good. Now, again, it took a little while to get to Preview 2, and a lot of times that has to do with, activity in the community. People have other jobs in an open standard community, and so some things slow down because people have to focus and produce good output. And that's a great thing to kind of pivot to our guest here. I want to introduce Dave McAllister. Dave works with us at NGINX, but Dave has a rather storied history in open standards and open source. Dave, you were instrumental in launching something that all of us are very familiar with. What was that?
Yeah, some of y'all might know this little standard that I was involved in called ISO 32000, otherwise known as the Portable Document Format, PDF. At Adobe, we realized that PDF was already ubiquitous to the world and was the standard for transmitting documentation. But we controlled it. We also realized that controlling it was a limiting factor. Nobody in their right mind makes money off of a standard. You make money off of tooling for standards. And so we went through the process, cleaned up the specification code, which had always been open. Anyone could just grab the spec and build anything they wanted to out of it. But we took it into ISO, and we were very pleased with the response of the countries around the world. ISO is a country-based environment. Had two major questions that we answered, and at that time were the fastest standard to ever go through the ISO process to full acceptance.
Wow.
It was amazing. It was also fascinating working at that level where, we're going to fly to China and meet with their Deputy Minister of Information Technology.
Wow.
And I'm still not sure what we had for lunch. but I
Now, you were at Adobe for roughly 8 years. Now, how much of that time was spent fighting for getting to a global standard?
Believe it or not, once we got through the first month of the fight, it moved really fast. We started the process we started the internal process of writing it in May and presented it to AIM, American Information and something Management. I've forgotten what the other I stands for now, for this, to go through what's called an ISO fast track process. It went into the ISO for the first time, I believe, in December of that year and was a fully approved standard by June of the next year.
Wow.
Which is blindingly fast.
That's exceptionally fast.
Yeah. The biggest cleanup we had to do were the infamous, we need to change wills and shalls to the right things for this. And the original spec included PostScript because, again, PostScript came out of the same company and the
Right.
same people. And so the original PDF specification, the first 2 chapters were PostScript. And so we
Oh,
had to
boy.
remove the PostScript information from this before we could push through the PDF standard.
Yeah, sometimes it's those little things, right? That you gotta. It's just the small wills and won'ts and shalls that you really have to make sure those are accurate. It has a lot to do with the relevance of the standard, and it has a lot to do with the implementations that come out of it, right?
Yeah, fortunately with Adobe on that standard, which honestly the specification had already shown up in open source code. It was actually called open source code at the time, something called GoScript. GoScript was written to the standard.
Right.
There were a lot of companies doing this. But early on, Adobe also identified that it didn't want to block anyone from using it by their patents. And they hold patents on PDF. And so they had granted in perpetuity the use of those patents.
Right.
Whether you made money off of it, whether you didn't make money off of it, those patents were granted. And that removed a lot of barriers for PDF becoming the thing that we all depend on every single day to, in our case, file our taxes or
Right.
read the latest documentation.
So we've already talked about a few things that are relevant, I think, to WebAssembly in terms of just getting through standards processes. It's the part of the process is making sure that the specification is written correctly and that that everybody follows the same specification. Part of it is going through the regular process and creating regularity in it. Are there? You've been watching Oscar work here. What lessons do you have to give him on how open standards can be driven much more effectively? What is WebAssembly doing right and what's it doing wrong?
So I'm going to give really great kudos to the way WebAssembly has put this together because they have done this by implementation. So it's really easy to write a standard with no consideration of the real world. Witness Ada 83 or Witness Ada 95, programming languages that were brilliant, but nobody in their right mind would ever use them. And I was an Ada guy, so I can safely make that statement. But because you're building something, you get to try it out. You get to see what works.
So I'll add a little bit of context here. For WASI Preview 2, one of the requirements for us to advance that proposal and say this thing has been launched was we had to have 2 independent implementations of the specification to show that it is real, it can be implemented by not just one, but multiple parties. And in fact, the only dissenting vote that even happened for the proposal was, honestly, it'd be great if we had a third, which is, fantastic that this is the way that we're thinking about it, because we want to make sure that this stuff is actually usable by people. Like, one, can you actually implement it? Are you going to find bugs? And we did find bugs. There were loads of bugs that ended up being found, particularly, like file system on Windows.
Yeah.
Shocker, right? But you actually do end up finding these things by doing the implementation. So I think it's phenomenal, that we're doing that.
You actually mentioned something I want to bring up as the second strong thing that I think WebAssembly is doing in terms of creating this de facto or realistic standard, de jure standard, is you're not based on pure consensus. You can have a dissenting vote, but for again picking on PDF, you can't have a dissenting vote. You actually have to read 100% of the committee voting on you has to agree before you can go through that standard, that fast track process.
Wow. And you fast-tracked it even though that was the operating standard they used.
Right. It was the operating standard. Everybody recognized it and so forth. But we had to add a different signature format for France. And that took us a couple of, about a week, I think, in here. And then we had to meet in China to explain to them the patent clauses.
I see. So the advice you're offering to WebAssembly is get ready for internationalization.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Getting ready for going international is always a challenge. Fortunately, since the WebAssembly standard is in W3C, they are a fast tracking organization. So they actually have the rights to take this directly to ISO.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Implementations, 2 implementations. If some would prefer 3. All of this work being done in the open. And I think that's also important to note. There have been other standards tracks that keep things, especially reference implementations, kind of insular, but all of this work was done in the open.
Yeah.
Open source is a huge component of what makes WebAssembly great. Can you speak to that? I know you've had a long history in open source as well, and that's what you do for Nginx.
Yes, I do open source, and I've been there longer than it's been called open source. But also, you've already pointed out, for instance, that things like Wasm time already have this working inside of it. If you built the standard and then built this afterwards, that wouldn't happen. You already have a head start to do this. And literally last night we saw Nginx Unit, an open source project, demonstrating working with components, which is amazing. It was introduced last Thursday. Okay,
That's great.
As of this recording, of course.
As
of this recording. So when you stop and think about that, open source allows you to get this massive head start. You can start learning now. The difference is that when we started open source way back in the dark ages, the phrase was coined in 1998, for heaven's sakes, for this. It was not standards driven. It was purely a itch to scratch. How do I do something that solves a problem I have? And what's now happened is that everybody has gravitated towards the innovation and implementation and speed and delivery capabilities of open source, that now open source powers commodity. Commodity equals standardization. And so we standardize things and then we build extensions to them, which allows us to tap this brilliant mindset of all the people that are working in any of these spaces.
Yeah.
You can't do that in standards bodies. Any of you, sooner or later, you're going to get to go to an ISO meeting. And the ISO meetings are very regimented and very, very structured. And I would sit in the ISO meeting, and they would call breaks when my head slipped below the level of the chair. The chairperson literally told us that after the final vote that she would judge. They never figure out why she was breaking what she did. She would go, I would watch Dave, and if his head slipped below the level of the chair, we took a break.
Very nice.
So-
Time management.
Yeah.
By Dave's head.
By Dave's head. So standards meetings are really, I hate to say it, boring as all get out. Except for the occasional breakouts where you have people screaming at each other. No, you can't say that in the spec for that. But nonetheless, when you look at this, open source has actually removed a lot of that barrier, because now when they say, oh, you can't say that, you go, we already are.
We already did that. Yeah, that's great.
It makes a big difference.
One thing I want to find out from you is, given your long history in open source, your long history in open standards, is there something in WebAssembly that you think WebAssembly should watch out for? Something that would be the death knell of an open standard?
Yeah, and this is one that standards all across the world fall into. Remember and keep in mind that standards are commodity-based. They are not innovation-based. You don't drive at the level or speed that open source innovates. And so don't try to catch up. Build to the common denominator and let your innovations happen around the outside.
That's incredibly interesting. And I'm going to take that to a number of folks who I know definitely want us to try and innovate a little bit harder than maybe we have, versus the crowd of people who say, hey, actually, I just want to have a standard that says I can go tell my boss, okay, this is stable and I can use this in production.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So I think that's incredibly interesting.
Yeah, think about it. We always used to use in the standards where we always point to the wall plugs. Where we are, we've got lots of things plugged in, charging, lots of wires that are connected in here. And imagine that somebody decided to innovate for the US plug structure and change them from this way to this way. Okay, now there are reasons actually to do them this way. There are really good engineering reasons to change them like this. But can you imagine what the impact would be on everybody in the entire world? Not just the US, everybody, because you've got adapters to worry about.
Yeah.
Standards are basis for building on top of, and you have to be able to depend that, to your point, they're stable and they're always present. Open source and open source standards have a really bad track record of this, starting with the Linux standard space way back in like 2002, joining with the open source development labs to form the Linux Foundation. The standard space was pretty much, okay, we're going to put these things here unless they're there, and they've got to also maybe be over there for that particular distribution. That's not a standard.
So let me ask you this. There are people in the community who are not happy with the speed at which the standard has been progressing. As the king of getting standards
things through
very quickly, what do you have to say to those people? And what do you have to say about the community with it taking quite a long time for us to, and I'm trying to think of, I don't want to get the amount wrong, but it's certainly been far more than a year. I want to say it's been 2 years since Preview 1 was launched, now that we have Preview 2. What do you say to folks who are dissatisfied with the speed?
I would point out, first of all, my first question is looking at me and says, do you think you got it right?
I think those people would say, well, it's not everything that I wanted.
That's not the question. That's not the question I asked. I asked, do you think you got it right? Do you think that what you provided is useful to the majority of people? This is, got to remember that standards are not individual. Open source is an individual itch to scratch. Standards are an itch for everyone to scratch. And that is something that open source guys don't worry about. Early often we'll fix it on the fly, or looking at the camera here, we'll fix it in post. That was the infamous Adobe phrase, we'll fix it in post, no matter what. And you've got to stop when you're working on standards and stop thinking about it from an individual basis and start thinking about it for the good of everybody. That, believe it or not, is incredibly hard to do. Because we all think about ourselves first, even when we don't think we're thinking about ourselves. And that's where I would start. Do you think that the majority of people can use Preview 2?
I mean, for me, I think, yeah, it's a solid base, which I think is exactly what it was trying to be.
Spot on.
Spot on. Base.
Be a base. Build on
Well,
top.
so, Dave, I want to ask you another question, and it relates to kind of your experiences managing some of the things at Red Hat. Red Hat, of course, a leader in the open source community, but also a company that I guess has been charged with being a little too opinionated and a little too controlling about certain things. As WebAssembly moves forward, what can we do to kind of keep to keep one dominant force from overruling all?
Yeah, and that is actually a really hard question. How do you keep a dominant party, either one person, one company, from actually controlling everything? And what has to happen is that the innovation can't just come from a single company. Flashing back to PDF, we knew that PDF was driven by Adobe. We also felt that was the wrong decision. So from a company basis, I'm fully in favor of the Adobe model. With Red Hat, what they're doing is trying to outperform you on innovation and adoption to become that stable base.
I see.
when you run into the standards basis, you need to stop and look at this and basically say, oh, Red Hat, you wrote this for the good of Red Hat. Or you wrote this for the good of Acme Anvil Corporation. And there may be great ideas in there, but it doesn't go through unchanged. It has to be good for everyone. It's the rule of many applies when you're looking at the standards process. There are certain companies, actually Red Hat's not terrible at this, because Red Hat does everything upstream first. So you can actually see what they're doing before they spring it on you. Mm-hmm. There are other companies who are notorious for walking into a meeting and going, oh, we have this wonderful thing that we think should be included, and drop 130 pages of standards text, which I know, Joel, you've looked at, and I suspect you've seen a little bit of it as well, which you sit here and you go, okay, where's my lawyer for this? And honestly, when you get into that category, I will flat out tell you, every time somebody's ever walked into that, and I've sat in the standards meeting, I don't care how cool it is, it's a no. I will automatically vote no. And it's because they're hiding something.
I see. Well, there are a lot of big names surrounding the WebAssembly standard right now.
Oh, yeah.
Intel is a constant contributor. You've got Microsoft contributing, backing with Blazor and things like that. Mm-hmm. Oscar, do you have any concerns over that?
Right now, yes and no.
Okay.
So I'd say no, because if you go take a look at all the companies that are participating in the Bytecode Alliance, for example, big page, there's a ton of companies on there. You see loads of good names. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to what companies are actively contributing to the standard, mm-hmm. it mostly boils down to just a couple. And that's not to throw shade, at all the other companies. It's very difficult, very, very difficult to fund open source and standards work.
Oh, yes.
It's incredibly difficult. I feel incredibly privileged that, now that I'm a part of F5, I had said to my boss, I'd love to spend 20% of my time working on standard stuff. And he said, oh, I was thinking more 50%. And I I was like, oh, okay, all right. And I'm like, all right, this is
good work if you can get it.
Yeah,
right?
So we'll take it, right? And not every company is able to do that. Obviously, we want to get more folks involved to make sure we're covering all the bases for everyone, right? Because a lot of the time, the only way you actually get funding to go work on standards is if your company says, we have a particular interest in this standard, and we want to make sure it goes our way, right?
Yeah.
Right.
So
that's actually the interesting question. And honestly, when we talk about this commoditization, quite often they're just driven by companies no matter what. Have y'all thought about how you represent individuals inside of a Wasm marketplace?
That's an interesting question. I'm not sure from a standards perspective, at least.
Yeah, the reason I'm thinking this up is that we're members of the Bytecode Alliance, but we had a huge amount of discussions with the Bytecode Alliance, and we're invited to come to the table before we ever agreed to sponsor this and bring our ideas and our concepts. We didn't get a vote, but we would be able to present the information and ideas that we had. Mm-hmm. And I will tell you that I believe that Bytecode Alliance driving that piece is amazingly ahead of the game of any other standards organization I can think of.
Yeah, it's a great organization, quite honestly. They are doing phenomenal work to make sure that, hey, we're continuing to advance the standard forward. Because typically, like if you just have your W3C group, mm-hmm. Folks are going to attend, folks are going to contribute, but there isn't necessarily a separate organization that says, hey, we want to make sure this stuff keeps pushing forward.
Right.
So, that in and of itself, maybe you love it, maybe you hate it, but it does cause us to move forward.
So one final thing I want to bring up, and it's the intersection of multiple standards. And WebAssembly has already, I'd argue, run into this.
Yeah.
An IETF standard here, an ECMA standard there. Obviously, JavaScript being an incredibly popular thing in WebAssembly. What are the risks of the intersections of these standards?
I'm going to use an ECMA story here. When we were doing ECMA, ECMAScript, of course, being based as a JavaScript for all practical purposes, the ECMAScript community through JSON changed the nature of the game. And it would have broken anybody who had written ECMAScript prior to do that. And what we had to do at that point in time was, as a standards group, TC39, we looked at this thing and said, we can't do this. And we then built the ECMAScript 5, 6, one of those two, that was still based on what we knew worked for the rest of the world, and we built an annex. That's it. You could use this, and it sort of had flags all over the place. So you can do it, but you just got to be really, really bloody careful. WebAssembly has a real problem because it's not a single language that you're approaching. You've got a lot of different places, a lot of different runtimes to deal with that. So.
Yeah, not doing too much of a sneak preview, but our next guest is going to have a lot of thoughts on how different parts of the standard definitely affect different languages and things that they're able to do, that's tough. It's hard to get consensus for something like, if you think about it from an assembly language perspective, make everybody happy with all the things they want to do with their different languages.
Yeah.
So.
You will never make everybody happy. And no matter what, somebody will find a hole that they can stick a finger into for this. And I remember when I first got introduced really to WebAssembly, probably 2019 or something, about that time frame, I remember reading this article in 2020 going, WebAssembly claims to be really secure, but I can write social cyber hacks in WebAssembly and deliver them to everybody's desktop. Therefore, it can't be secure. What? Sorry, I think we have a different meaning of the word security when we're talking about it that level.
I also hadn't thought about that. I love the idea of, I'm going to write this really portable hack, and I'm going to push it to the edge. I'm going to push it to everyone. I love that. So, runs on ARM.
Exactly. New application of edge computing.
Yeah.
Excellent.
I do. I just remember scratching my head and looking at that one and going, I don't get where they're coming from, because I can write that hack in anything I want to write it in, and it's nothing to do with WebAssembly. But the portability aspect, really strong.
Crazy. Well, with that, I think it's about time to wrap up. Any final thoughts, Oscar?
Well, I just want to say, it's been phenomenal having you on, Dave. As an open source enjoyer myself, I love it. It's a ton of fun. It's great to do things out in the open. I have a lot more questions for you after the show about maybe some of the Red Hat stuff and things like that. But yeah, definitely appreciate you coming on and giving us your fantastic knowledge.
Yeah, and I won't quite qualify myself as a PDF enjoyer, but I certainly use the products often. Thank you for all that you've done in the past on open standards and open source, and it's been a pleasure to have you here.
Yep, and I
thank you
appreciate
very
y'all
much.
letting me come in and blab at you a little bit and tell some of my background stories, and hopefully share a little bit of insightful information at the same point in time.
I think we've done that. For myself, for Dave, for Oscar, we appreciate you guys being with us on this special edition of WebAssembly Unleashed. We'll be back with you very shortly with a new episode, and we're going to discuss how WebAssembly might go bad. Stay with us.
That's a wrap for our WebAssembly adventure, fellow Code Explorers. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, may Wasm be with you.